Good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Likens-Rich. I'm Deputy Director at the Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, where I've worked for 13 years. So I have a long experience there and in our community, and was asked on Tuesday to pinch hit for Grafton. So my intention is to do some things today. But I want to start with thinking about what intention is. Very briefly, I watched my dear friend Dan Moulthrop's presentation, and I was like, a definition, great way to start. So intention is something that you want and plan to do. And we all set intentions. I occasionally do yoga. I philanthropically give to a yoga studio in my community every month and attend very rarely. And every time I start, they're like, set your intention for your practice and center yourself, which is a great recommendation. So this morning, when some of you woke up and decided you were coming, I'm sorry, I don't have my notes, so I'm just going to wing this. Important to think about this. Intention is not results. So it's something we plan to do. It's a goal we set ourselves institutionally, but it isn't actually necessarily what happens. And I think that's going to be important in my conversation about intention. Some of you came today expecting to see Grafton, and so your intention was to potentially hear from him and about his vision and his work at the Cleveland Institute of Art. So you are in the moment, setting new intentions and new expectations for what I might deliver. So these are some of my intentions as I was thinking about this talk. The first was say something that makes sense. So I think I've at least said one thing so far, so that intention is going as planned. And then I thought more and I was like, how about say something that resonates with some of you? Resonance is something we talk a lot about at MoCA. This idea of you hear, experience something that you actually feel, that connects with something inside of you, that is relatable, that moves you in some way. So that's part of my intention. Then I was like, wait, let's be serious, like you work at a museum. So I should say something about how the concept of intention relates to experiences with contemporary art. That is my industry. It's something I've worked in for a very long time. So that should be my intention. And then I was like, that's it. My intention is to say something that ignites your curiosity and inspires you to set new intentions about your engagement with contemporary art and culture, which is a really high expectation and intention, and it may not happen. But part of this is about setting the mindset, right? That intention is about mindset. It's about the goals you set and then how you direct and focus your mind. So I'm going to talk about intention as it relates to my industry in 3 areas. I'm going to start with artist intention. We work with artists. That is our mission. Living artists, for the most part. Most of the work we show has been made recently or just in the last few months or in the last few years. And artistic intention is important to what we do. The second thing I'm going to talk about is institutional intention. What does it mean for an organization to have intention? And how does that actually influence what happens here in Cleveland? And then the third is audience intention. You are the audience for this talk, but you are also an audience of culture. And what does it mean for you to set intention? So I'd start with the obvious question for some of you. How many of you have actually been to MoCA before? By raising hands. Excellent. Very wonderful. That is wonderful to see. So that's most of the audience. So this question may not seem unfamiliar to you, but what is contemporary art is something that will set the stage for my talk. And I've given a lot of distance learning presentations in the last few years to people who don't have a lot of experience with contemporary art and frankly are a little skeptical. And so there's a lot of definitions of what art is. There are philosophers who have grappled with this topic for centuries. And I came up with a definition that's my own before this talk. And then I looked back at it and I was like, oh, this relates. So my definition, based on my experience working in contemporary art, the Museum of Contemporary Art, is that contemporary art is the intentional expression of ideas through materials in our current time. And all of those underlined words, if you can in fact see them on the screen, are very important, especially the notion of intentionality. So another way to put it is like an equation that an artist starts with an idea. All artists start with an idea. No artists work without idea. There's always some material involved. The crux, the challenge now is the materials can be virtually anything. You are all materials, and I'll reach back to that idea later on. Some artists use traditional materials, some use incredibly unconventional materials. But then there's always intention. There's always something that drives that action towards some sort of result. Can you see this image, some of you? Okay, so This is an image of an artist, Yves Klein, French artist, and it's called Leaping into the Void. And I use this image to describe artistic intention because artists are risk takers. They're courageous. They're people who step outside of norms. They challenge expectations. And in many cases, their intention is to almost throw themselves out and off into the void, as Yves Klein is doing here. Looks literally. This is one of the earliest photoshopped images ever. He indeed had something under him. But this notion of intentionality being also something that you can set without knowing the result is incredibly important. It's also important to consider that as we're thinking about artist intention, that artists are all types of people. These are some of the artists that we have shown at MoCA recently and will be showing in the near future. And they are as close as Glenville, and they're as far as New Zealand. They are all ages, they are all races, they are all orientations, gender. They have different belief structures, they have different experiences, and all of that inflects their intentionality. And so the only thing that I can say about artist intentions is that they all intend to create. That is the one unifying concept or intention that I've noted in my work with artists, is that to make is the ultimate intention of art. What they make, of course, is up for grabs. Now, by a raise of hands, how many of you have been inside of a gallery? And I don't know if you can see this image, but this gentleman is standing in front of what would be described as an incredibly minimalist abstract painting, a black square, a white rectangle, black square. It looks something like an Ellsworth Kelly that you might see at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And he's standing with his hands on his hips. You can't see his face, but you can imagine there might be a sort of look of skepticism. So by raising hand, how many of you have been in a gallery, looked at a work of art, and thought, ugh, this artist is trying to pull one over on me. This is ridiculous. Right, me too. I'm going to say from my experience, and I've worked with contemporary artists for 20 years, artists do not intend to pull one over on their audience. In fact, I find that the one challenge with some artists is they're actually not thinking about you at all, which might be hard to swallow. That's our job, is to really think about you. But artists are never doing art just to pull one over on you. Even if their intention is only to explore the formal qualities of aesthetics, color, form, line, gesture, that's still an intention, and whether or not it relates to you, we'll get to. That's a different thing. But the attention is always there. This is really critical, however, and something that can be a hard relationship that we even have with artists, is that intent is not meaning. So you can intend to do a lot of things as an artist. You can intend to create a certain kind of work or to make a certain statement, but that doesn't necessarily relate to the meaning of the work, because meaning is contingent. Meaning is subjective. Meaning comes from intent meeting experience, and the experience often is brought by the viewer. So artist intent is incredibly important. It's what helps us understand where we started from and where we ended. It helps us understand how to talk about the work, but it doesn't necessarily help us understand what the meaning of the work is. Those are different things. To give an example, and it's sort of a physical example of a metaphoric idea. So this is a work by Jay DeFeo called The Rose. Has anyone ever seen this work in person? It's sort of traveled around. This is a massive work. It's 12 feet high. It's multiple inches deep. Jay DeFeo is a woman. She was a Beat Generation artist, and she was an incredible force in California art in the 50s and 60s. One of the first to have Allen Ginsberg read at her art gallery. This work was a second piece to a first piece called The Jewel, and it was originally called The Death Rose. And when she started it, it was for an exhibition that she was having at the Whitney, I believe, in the late 50s, where she was showing The Jewel, and she never finished this painting in time, and so she just continued to work on it. For 8 years, she worked on this painting in her studio. Talk about a shift in intention. You start, I'm going to make a painting for a show, and then you just keep working on this painting, and in working on it, she keeps building it up and building it up and building it up and changing it, and there are pictures each year of how it's progressing and shifting and changing. It got so big that in 1966, when the rent got too high, she had to move out of her apartment. And in order to get it out, this is a truck, this is a Belkin's moving truck, they had to literally take the side of the apartment and the window off and crane the painting out of the studio in order to get it out into the public. And I show this image because what's important about it is the artist's original intent changes the minute the work literally leaves the studio. So at the point that that comes out, suddenly intention is just one part of the picture. Another artist I'd like to talk about is the artist who created this work behind me, Judy's Hand Pavilion. His name is Tony Tassett. He's a Chicago-based artist who works in a variety of media, does sort of small-scale photo and video and digital work, but also monumental sculpture. And he's standing here in front of another piece of his called The Eye, which is located in Dallas. Tony was one of the few artists invited by Case Western Reserve University about 9 months ago to submit a proposal for a pavilion project here on Toby's Plaza in relation to Front International, which is a triennial art exhibition happening in the city right now. And in that proposal, Case put forth some very specific intentions about what they were looking for. These are drawn from a subsequent interview that Kathy Berry, who's in the audience, who was the spearheader and project manager and visionary for this project, put forth as some of the intentions of Case. They wanted a temporary cutting-edge structure for Toby's Plaza, which is where we're standing. They wanted a focal point to attract people to the area, and they wanted something that was both unexpected and functional for a wide range of events, like talks. Well, look at that, Kathy. Intention realized. So then the artist responded, and likewise, Tony Tassett set some intentions in his proposal, and his intentions was to create a spectacular perceptual gesture, kind of funny, gesture, yeah, to make something accessible to a wide range of audiences, to have something that's suggestive but with no set meaning, and to have something that spoke to the relationship of the body and its structures to the notion of architecture, which is very interesting when you consider the hand's relationship to our building and some of the structural forms that emerge between the two. And so we'll talk more about this piece in a really, but I want you to keep those intentions in mind. So we work with artists, and as all of you do in your work, you start at point A with the intention, and then you want to get to point B. And in many of your industries, I imagine that the best way to do that is the straight line. Efficient, direct, focused. It's the way to get there fastest. It's the way to get there the most concisely. And we work with artists who do this, who start with an intention, and then they're focused and they're direct, and exactly what happened, what we thought would happen, happens, and it's wonderful. And we really do strive sometimes to get those artists because we also need breaks. But more realistically, this is the path of the artist that we work with, where we start at point A with an intention, and then we meander through experimentation, failure, remix, repositioning, returning, innovation, and eventually land at point B, which may be actually kind of where we thought we would land, but the path to get there was incredibly different. The most interesting artists, I will say, the artists that you want to work with, if you're in my field, are the artists that start at point A and then take you to an entirely different point C that you never expected. And the road may be straight or it may be curving, but ultimately that's how you grow and advance culture. That is the path that we all strive to be on with artists, is to take us from intention to a point that we couldn't even have imagined. And this is an artist who does this, who we're working with currently. This is Hank Willis Thomas. Some of you may be familiar with his work as an artist. This is a piece of his from a series called Branded. He's had exhibitions at the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Transformer Station. He's very highly acclaimed, very well known for his photograph-based and now emerging sort of mixed media practice. But in 2016, Hank and another artist named Eric Gottesman founded the first artist super PAC that was called For Freedoms. And the goal of that super PAC was to inject critical conversation into political conversation using art. And Hank has always been an artist, as you can see from the previous image, who's interested in politics, and particularly politics of the body, and more specifically of the Black body, and the way in which race is perceived through consumerism, through stereotypes, through bigotry. But this was an entirely different gesture. He wasn't making an artwork. He was making a kind of collective political power out of the artist that he knew. And what this has resulted in is quite astonishing. And if you had asked Hank at the beginning where we would end, we wouldn't even have known. At this point, Mocha's been doing town halls with For Freedoms for the last 2 years. We just did our 5th one last Saturday. And these are convenings of the community to talk about relevant issues with artists. And the notion of creativity being injected in those is critical for our civic dialogue. Also, he has now initiated a 50-state initiative where every state will be doing For Freedoms projects between September and November in the midterm election. So from where this artist started as a photo-based artist making art that hung in galleries to where he is now, having universities in Alabama put on town halls and billboard projects and other kinds of social practice embedded in the community art, is astonishing, and we would have never known based on his original intentions where we were going. Now I want to step into institutional intention. Excuse me. That's our building. We built it with intention, a lot of intention, a lot of intention. The architect had intentions for the building, that the exterior would reflect the surroundings and be ever changing like our interior program because we don't have a collection. As an institution, when you walk in the front door at 11 when we open, you'll note that we write our mission on the door, and some of the intentions that we set forth in our program are to push the boundaries of innovation, to do exhibitions, programs, and publications, to be a gathering place for discovery, inspiration, and thoughtful exchange, to provide the means so you can make the meaning, and to push culture forward. These are things that buttress the work that we do and underpin all of the ways that we approach how we do our work. And at our core, our intention is always to be two things at once, which is a complicated mission. To be both an advocate for contemporary art and ideas on a global level, a global and globally engaged institution who is always an ambassador for Cleveland, always locally focused, always rooted here in this place, doing relevant work here in Cleveland. But the reality is, intention is preferential. When you set intentions, you set them with your own biases. And unfortunately, there are times where you don't even know what those are going to produce. And sometimes you set intentions for one thing and a negative thing happens because you didn't actually think about the intentions for that other part. So I'm going to tell you a story about that. So in 2016, we did an exhibition of Do-Ho Suh, who's a Korean artist, internationally renowned, incredible sculptor. Who saw this show? Okay. So what you experienced in the gallery, in the main part you see here, which might be kind of hard to see, what is a large apartment modeled on his apartment building in New York City that was built in 1900, made entirely of silk, every detail replicated to the most specific degree, including the light switches and the furnace and everything done in silk with thread, hung on a very thin steel frame that you could walk through as if you were walking through some sort of ghostly apartment. It's an incredible piece. He worked on it for over 10 years. It's sort of a magnum opus of this body of work. And when we opened in October of 2016, we had 1,200 people come to the opening, one of our biggest openings ever, and we had a line out the door to see the work and experience it. And we were super excited. Unfortunately, our intention, of course, was to show an international artist an exceptional work of art, to have the audience be able to experience this work physically. And we took the show from another institution that gave us some parameters. And one of those parameters was, because of the size of the door frames, people who use wheelchairs and mobility devices cannot go inside the piece. And they wrote in their security brief, but that's okay because it's a transparent piece and you can experience it fully by moving around the outside and looking in. And so we just were like, okay, we do that. That's the safety, keeping the piece safe. We don't own it, obviously. So the night of the opening, two women, Donna and a friend, came. Donna is a woman who uses a wheelchair. She lives actually right over on 115th, and her friend uses a walker, and they stood in line for a fairly long period of time until one of our gallery attendants quietly came up to them and said, I just want you to know, and then explained the policy. And Donna was rightfully pissed. She was extremely angry. And she immediately went and sought out a manager to ask if that indeed was the case, and they told her yes. And so she quietly went out of the gallery with her friends, and they had the rest of their night. And then about a week later, I got a call from Steve Hansler, who's the director of Maximum Access Housing of Ohio, which is also an organization located right down the street, who are advocates for people with disabilities, particularly people who use mobility devices, mostly in the realm of housing, but in other things as well. And he wanted a meeting about this topic. And so we came to the museum with Donna. We walked through the gallery. I explained the nature of the piece, the impressiveness of the work, the reason we couldn't let people in, about its delicacy, about the fact that it was based on a 1900 apartment building that was built long before ADA requirements. And after all of that, and they nodded and they were very receptive, we sat down and we began to talk more. And the first thing he asked me was, I just want to understand why you thought it was okay to discriminate against someone. And that was not my intention. That was not any of our intentions. But that didn't matter. at all. Because the result was that we did, in fact, discriminate against a group of people because we hadn't thought about how to address that issue with a group because it just wasn't part of our mindset at the time. And so the preferential intention that we sent wasn't based on people who were unlike perhaps most of the people that I work with. And so we immediately made changes. Immediately. We worked with the artist who also didn't have the intention on excluding anyone in his work when he was making it, on determining just how big a wheelchair could be to pass safely through. And we made graphs for the ground so we could let anyone using a mobility device of a certain size be able to pass through. We put all of the interior images on an iPad and on handouts so people who couldn't go through could still look at all of the interior nuances. But that still didn't seem like enough for me, to be honest. I was really upset that our intention had excluded a group of people. So then I went to University Circle Incorporated and Maximum Access Housing of Ohio, and I said, I feel like we need to have conversations more regularly about this. I didn't even know. I didn't know to think about this and with the artists to plan for this. It's not something in my mindset. How can we do better? And so we came together. We began a series of workshops for museums and cultural organizations in UCI to talk about these issues and understand how to approach them more successfully. We began a series of internal workshops and learnings to help us understand how to be better at inclusion. And we began reaching out to organizations who work with people with disabilities to have them come to the museum with their constituents to help us understand how we could be better at our practice. 2 years later, I was at a meeting of a gathering of CPAC on the topic of inclusion in arts and culture, and Chris Garr, who works for Youth Challenge, which is an incredible organization that brings sport and culture to youth with disabilities, said this, unprompted, to the group. Cultural organizations in Cleveland should learn the MoCA way because they know how to do inclusion right in ways that are both accommodating and also respectful to people with disabilities. And that showed me that we had indeed shifted our intention and were actually making results. That didn't mean that we're getting everything right, but it did indicate to me that we were actually making a change in the way that we approached our work. We also made changes in how we worked with artists. Amusingly, the next fall, literally 1 year later, I did a show with an artist from Detroit who, in fact, wanted to do a replica of an apartment built in the early 20th century. I was like, get out of town, stop, I don't want to do these anymore. And his was a physical replica, meaning he was bringing doors from the building in Detroit. And this is the actual entrance. His name is Anders Ruwald. And we worked together to make sure that every part, and this is impossible for you to see, it was all black charred interior. Every door, every passage could be accommodated by people who use mobility devices. And then we had ADA Cleveland bring a group of 20 individuals, adults and children, who use wheelchairs. And they had a tour of that show successfully, which was an indication of growth in our ability to set better intentions in working with artists on projects. So at this point, I would say one of MoCA's biggest intentions is inclusion, to become a museum that serves all, not just audiences who are able, audiences who are disabled, audiences of all races, audience of all classes and excuse me, age. And so this is now our intention, which has dramatically shifted how we approach our work. Now I want to talk a little bit, third, about you, all of you, and how you set intentions around culture. So this is an image of Richard Long. It's a 1963 work in Nepal, a line work. And I show this image because I always have this in my head about audiences. I actually, as a curator, I consider myself a bridge between the artist and the audience. I care as much about the audience's experience as the artist. And that's not to say that other curators don't, but audience is often not the front of mind for some curators. But I often think to myself, if an artist makes a work and no one sees it, it's like if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? If an artist makes a work with intention but nobody sees it, is it a work? Not really. I mean, it is, but it doesn't actually make any impact. And so artists have to share their work with audience. And audience have to make intention. So this image, anybody here do this? This is Spencer Tunick, 2004. I did not, but I know someone did. No, you didn't do it either, did you? Spencer Tunick in 2004 came to Cleveland on MoCA's bequest, and we commissioned him to do a new work. Spencer gathers nude bodies in public and semi-public spaces to make incredible photographs, and this ended up being the largest project he'd ever did. We had over 2,000 people come to downtown Cleveland on an early Saturday morning, I believe. It was about 45 degrees in June. It was strangely cold. take all their clothes off and then lay on the road on East 9th up by the Mather to create this amazing work of art. And in that moment, the artist's intention and the audience intention were aligned. They became the medium and the process by which the artist was able to realize his intention, which is a really beautiful moment. In reality, in our galleries, we can do the best shows ever, but if you're not standing there with intention to experience in them, then our work is a fail. And so the intentionality that you bring to your experience is very important because intention influences mindset and consequently experience. So as you're thinking about what you do in relation to culture, not just art museums, but any culture, and sometimes I treat culture with leisure, but there's still intent. And so some things I want you to think about the next time you're doing something cultural is why did you and the others you're with choose to have this experience? Why are you doing this? And what are you looking to get out of it? We ask that of our audiences often, so especially on tours, so that we can understand how we can match your intention and your expectations to give you the most rewarding experience possible. And we often work with two of our characters, two of our friends. This is Beauregard and Sherry, the art squad, who are the vehicles for family learning at MoCA. They are art preparators. They work at MoCA. They help put art up. And Beauregard and Sherry have three very simple goals when they work with audiences. Their goals are to help you look, think, and share. It's a very simple concept. Based on the idea of how we interpret art, we observe, we apply and analyze, and then we synthesize to make meaning. And so this is a very simple way of thinking about, but one you can carry with you when you come into the museum and set intentions. So we're going to try this. An important fact to know, which is actually more impressive than I thought, because we've all been working, I think, saying this folkloric thing that audiences only look at art for 4 seconds at a time. But in fact, you spend 28 seconds looking at a work of art, which is not very long, but it's still longer than we thought. So we're going to do an exercise, because I want you to think about how you can set intentions and get more out of your art looking and an art experience moving forward. So there's a work of art behind me, so convenient. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to look at it for a whole minute, nearly 3 times the length of time that you normally look at a work of art. So I know this is going to be a stretch for some of you, but I think you can do it. I'm going to ask you to look at it for 1 solid minute. And while you're looking at it, and you can start now, I'll just sort of keep track of time. I want you to think about a few key questions. What do you see? I want you to look at all the parts. I want you to consider the form, the color, the scale, the lines. I want you to think about how the artist may have made the work. I want you to reach back to early in my presentation and think about some of the intentions that were set by the artist and by the institution, by Case, for the project. A pavilion that would be unexpected yet familiar, a spectacular gesture, something suggestive but no set meaning. I want you to think about what it brings up in you. Like, what does it remind you of? What does it make you think about in your own life? Does it match something? I want you to think about what it would look like from the other side, even though you can't see it. What it looks like in context when you look at it against other things in this space, the trees, the buildings, the sky, the grass. And then I want you to think a little bit now. I want you to think about what you've looked at. And I want you to get a question, one question in your mind about this work. Any question at all. Doesn't have to be profound. This is the hardest thing for audiences, adult audiences in particular, is I want you to have a question in mind and no one's going to judge you. We are non-judging. We are setting intentions right now as a non-judgmental group. Does everyone have a question? You're not going to tell them to me because I'm not answering questions because I'm not the expert. And that's something to keep in mind about this. We are not the experts. I've trained in art history. I know stuff. I know very little more about this than you do, to be honest. Like, I told you most of what I know. I haven't spent time with the artist. I haven't spent a long time studying this work in relation to other work, so I don't know. You all have information and experience that you can share with one another. So what I want you to do now is to share with the person sitting next to you or nearby. I want you to turn to someone nearby. If you don't know them, I want you to introduce yourself by name and maybe share the intention of coming today. And then I want you each to ask one another the question you have. And if you feel like you can answer it, go ahead. And if not, that's okay too. So I'm going to give about 2 or 3 minutes. So go. All right. That I don't want to stop conversation, but I would like to wrap myself up so that you guys can have more of this. That was awesome. You totally did that without any hesitation. And I hope for some of you drew out some interesting considerations. How many of you heard a question or had a conversation that introduced a new idea or something you weren't necessarily thinking about when you were looking at the hand? This is important. This is what we believe in. Mocha believes that dialogue is key to understanding art and understanding our world, and that by talking with one another civilly, empathically, we understand more about the world we live in. And so when we think about intention as an audience, I ask you, when you come to an art museum or when you go to a cultural experience, a theater performance or a concert, if you can set an intention that's about engaging with another person in that experience, asking each other questions about what you want to get out of it, and when it's done, how did that go? Did that meet our expectations? Was there more that we could have found or done? And in the moment, be present, slow down, experience, put the phone down, unless the phone is important to the work, because that actually is inside. You have to have your phone for one of our work, so hooray. But put the phone down and be present and engage and have that intentionality, because that's where the reward of culture comes from, is when you are able to set intentions and then match them to your experience. So I thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, and have a great weekend.